Is Saudi Arabia's foreign policy putting oil price recovery at risk? Faced with low economic growth and rising levels of government debt, Saudi Arabia needs higher oil prices. As a response to the slumped market, the Saudis brought together a group of countries comprising 40 members of OPEC and 10 other major oil producers, and they agreed to reduce their current crude oil production by just shy of 2 million barrels per day. An arrangement that, if it can be held together, is officially due to run until the end of 2018. The fear in Riyadh is of a disorderly end to the deal, with several participating countries increasing exports rapidly in an attempt to undercut the rest of the group, with the result that oil prices continue to fall, negating the whole process and reason behind the production cuts. Saudi Arabia is pursuing a foreign policy that is designed to prevent this from happening. But it's a high-risk move and may well still fail. The fall in global oil prices since late 2014 led to a decline in the Saudi government's revenues and a rise in borrowing in order to fund government spending, leading to a record budget deficit of $98 billion or 15% of GDP. Since then, the deficit has indeed fallen and is officially forecast to be $52 billion for 2018, or around 7% of this year's GDP. Whilst this is an improvement in the numbers we saw in 2015, it still means that the government will miss its target of bringing its budget into balance by 2020. This date has now been pushed back to 2023 and is built upon some ambitious assumptions being met. For example, in order to achieve it, oil production will have to rise by about 1 million barrels per day, and global crude prices must go above $75 per barrel. Over the past few years, borrowing by the Saudi government has had a cumulative effect on the kingdom's public debt, which is estimated at just shy of $150 billion, or 21% of GDP. Part of the borrowing, it has to be said, has been used in a way to stimulate the economy, which last year shrank by 0.5%. The government hopes to keep borrowing under control this year by raising a number of consumption taxes and reducing subsidies on domestic fuels and electricity. It also expects to benefit from higher oil prices as a result of last year's production agreement. Oil revenues this year are officially forecast to be $131 billion, or $14 billion up on those we saw in 2017. Finally, there is also the prospect of infusion of funds from the proposed sale of 5% of the national oil company, Saudi Aramco, this year via an IPO, which could net the government over $100 billion. The precise amount depends, in no small part, on both global crude prices at the time and the market's expectations of the prices following the IPO. The Saudis therefore have a number of reasons to desire firm and rising oil prices, and thus to avoid a disorderly end to this year's production pact. It is on all of this that the Saudi government is now focusing its foreign policy. The achievement of a strong and stable oil price is being approached from two separate directions, which supply the principal strands of Saudi Arabia's policy in relation to its oil exporting neighbours. The first of these is the formation of close alliances with nearby oil producers, aimed at securing their cooperation in avoiding a sudden rise in output whenever the present output reductions come to an end. When this cooperation is deemed to be unlikely or unavailable, the Saudis are pursuing a policy of confrontation. This oil carrot and stick approach is most clearly illustrated in the case of UAE and Iran. In the case of the former, the Emirates produce around 3 million barrels per day, but are turning into a much more dynamic producer and exporter. This thus presents a challenge to Saudi Aramco. The UAE and Saudi Arabia nevertheless have a number of aims and objectives in common. Both have been supportive of the agreements to reduce production in global oil prices and see eye to eye a number of regional issues. Both of them oppose what they see as a threat from radical Islam in the form of Islamic State in Iraq, Syria and Libya, along with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Their antipathy towards the Muslim Brotherhood brought them both into conflict with the new Muslim Brotherhood's ally in Qatar, against which Saudi Arabia has imposed an economic blockade. The main long-term threat, however, is seen by each as coming from Iran. They are already involved in proxy wars with Iran in Syria and Yemen, and both of them regard Iran as a threat to global oil prices when the present output cuts come to an end, since Iran herself has ambitious plans to increase production in the next few years. Iran's support in the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the Houthi rebels in Yemen has brought it into direct conflict with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which supports groups that have been trying to overthrow Assad, while in Yemen they both back the government against which the Houthis are in rebellion. Anti-Assad forces have received various forms of aid from the Saudi and the Emiratis, while in Yemen the two have engaged in direct military action. The conflict shows no signs of coming to an end and has recently looked like escalating following the firing of rockets by the Houthis into Saudi Arabia. The inability of the Saudi-led intervention to restore order in Yemen makes it increasingly likely that the Saudis and the Emiratis will find themselves disagreeing over the future direction of the conflict. For the time being, the Saudis and Emiratis have no obvious role in the Syrian conflict. They have, however, found themselves in opposition to the Emir of Qatar and, by extension, Iran, over his support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. In June 2017, they broke diplomatic relations with Doha and imposed a range of sanctions targeting the Qataris' exports of oil. These initially consisted of the banning of shipping en route from Qatar from ports in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, therefore preventing tankers from co-loading Qatari and Saudi crudes. These and other related measures, while inconveniencing the Qataris, did not prevent them from exporting their oil. Indeed, it also highlighted the potential limits and strains in this approach. The UAE in particular has tried to keep its actions to a minimum since it needs to import natural gas in bulk from Qatar. Riyadh has long seen Iran as the main threat to its political and economic influence in the Middle East, as well as to Saudi Arabia's dominance of OPEC. The immediate concern is with Iran's growing influence in Iraq, which, along with Iran, could pose a substantial threat to Saudi Arabia's share of world oil markets, particularly the large and growing market across Asia. Tehran's present links with Baghdad date mainly from the US-led invasion of 2003 and its bloody aftermath, in where Iran gave support to various Shia groups in the south of Iraq as unrest grew between Iraq's Shia and Sunni populations. Since then, it's offered financial and military aid to help Baghdad in its campaign to liberate parts of northern Iraq from Islamic State. At the same time, Iran has also been increasing its energy ties with Iraq. For example, in 2017 it began to export gas to Iraq, helping to ease a shortage there and to allow Iraq to generate some of its electricity from natural gas rather than the burning of crude oil. Riyadh is anxious to prevent any further rapprochement between Iraq and Iran and to prevent the opening of an Iraqi export route through Iran itself. As a result, Iraq is a major target for Saudi diplomacy, not simply because it lies next door to the kingdom, but also because of Iraq's importance as an oil producer, both now and more particularly in the future. Iraq, let's not forget, has huge reserves and ambitious plans to increase crude oil production from 600,000 barrels per day currently to over 5 million barrels per day by the time the non-OPEC deal comes to an end. The Iraqi government is therefore in a position to place Saudi Arabia off against Iran and appears to be firmly turning to its neighbours from the east rather than the south. Riyadh's proposals for energy links are long-term and fail to address the immediate needs of Baghdad. Let's be clear, what Iraq needs before all of this is a new export route for its northern fields, including Kirkuk, and the best prospect for this is Iran's proposed pipeline link to the Gulf. The US is belatedly becoming concerned about Iranian influence over Iraq and is offering its support to any initiative that is designed to improve relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. At present though, both in Iraq and across the Gulf region, the momentum lies with Iran, not Saudi Arabia.